Hello and welcome to Breaking Ground, how archaeology and built heritage can unlock developments and strengthen place. This is a Festival of Place bite-sized learning event run in association with Civic. So today we're finding out how to turn archaeology from a perceived obstacle into an asset on site. We'll be sharing project case studies and hearing from professionals about how the fabric of a place can trigger attachment, community support, and feelings of belonging. So my name is Christine Murray. I'm the founder and director of the Festival of Place and editor-in-chief of The Developer, and I'm your chair for this session. And I'm so excited that we are collaborating this with Civic, who are supporting this bite size today. We're going to see some unique finds from sites in the UK, which I'm super excited about, and gain a clear understanding of how archaeology requirements are triggered and managed in live schemes, and practical insights into reducing project and cost uncertainty. So we'll be taking your questions at the close of the event. So do stick around for that so that you can shape your learning for this session. We really want to support your professional learning goals at the Festival of Place. If you love this event, then be sure to join us on the 10th of June at the Festival of Place at Box Park, Wembley in London. We have some great offers on tickets and membership at the moment. So if this is your first time joining us, you're welcome to use the chat to say hello, tell us where you're from, share your comments or other resources. We will be taking your questions. There is a Q&A tab on that chat window, and you can put your questions in at any time, and I will pick those up either during the running of the session or during our Q&A session later on. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. I'm going to introduce them all now, but you'll be meeting them as they come on with their presentations. So Louise Brennan is Director of Region at Historic England and works across the country, delivering expertise, planning and listing advice, grants and major programs while building strong partnerships to protect and celebrate the historic environment, ensuring that heritage can play its part in sustainable growth. Currently, Louise oversees the £15 million Heritage at-Risk Capital Fund, ensuring the preservation of vulnerable heritage assets. We're also going to be joined by Richard Spackman, who is Development Director at Capital and Centric, where he's worked on projects including Cannon Brewery in Sheffield and Weir Mill in Stockport. We're going to be hearing about Weir Mill a little bit later. Richard was previously project manager at De Trafford, where he was working on the company's residential portfolio across the Northwest, including the Manchester Gardens master plan. And now we've got the team from Civic. Graham Mottershead is Associate Director in Civic's Archaeology and Built Heritage team. A highly experienced commercial archaeologist, Graham has delivered a broad range of projects from small-scale evaluations and watching briefs to large infrastructure excavations. We've got Katie Fletcher, a co-director of Archaeology and Built Heritage at Civic. Katie is an experienced archaeologist and heritage consultant specializing in heritage management. She supports clients in navigating complex planning requirements while identifying and managing risk. And Ollie Cook is co-director of Archaeology and Built Heritage at Civic and an accomplished field archaeologist with more than a decade of experience. He has led major investigations at Lancaster Castle and Caernarvon Castle, and Ollie specializes in the planning and delivery of fieldwork projects from excavation and post-excavation analysis through to reporting and publication. So I promised we were going to show some finds today, and we're going to play a little game of Guess the Find. So the team is joining me here on stage. Hello, everyone. But here is Guess the Find one. So take a good look. What do you think this is and why it was made? Answers in the chat, please. And you are going to find out a little bit later in the session what we're looking at here. What are these finds and why were they made? So if anyone wants to take a guess, please put your answers in the chat. And Ollie is going to let us know what he thinks, what he knows this is, I should say, as opposed to what we think it is. So we've got finger bone. Lucy's already in there too. Are these finger bones? I think we're going to find out. So in the meantime, I'm now going to invite Graham to speak and kick off the presentation. So Graham, if you want to join me on stage, I like this. Musical instruments, bones, wig curlers. Excellent. Beads from a necklace. Super exciting.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to talk briefly about heritage and archaeology uh, and how it works with development. But initially, I'd just like to introduce Civic as a company. We bring together a range of complementary services, as well as archaeology and heritage. We include engineering, sustainability, geoconsultancy, and community engagement. As the image shows, our work focuses on bringing the natural and urban worlds together, recognizing that nature should be an integral part of how our towns and cities function. The various different elements that make up Civic work across all the services because we believe the built environment functions as a connected system, and that collaboration is key to creating healthier, more resilient places. Could I have my next slide? Archaeology has been an integral part of the planning system for almost 40 years now and spans from initial project feasibility through the design and planning stages and into project commencement, often as a planning condition, not always, but usually as a planning condition, at least part of it. When I say archaeology here, I mean archaeology, heritage, built heritage in general, and it includes both below ground archaeological remains, the sort of traditional view of archaeology, and also built heritage, which is historic buildings and structures that are still standing. Typically, archaeology sits within REBA stages 0 to 4. Usually any archaeological fieldwork that needs to be done will be completed prior to the commencement of construction, although it does sometimes overlap into the initial stages of groundworks and demolition. Could I have my next slide, please? At the outset of a project, archaeology and heritage input is largely about understanding whether there are any heritage issues and how those issues might impact a development, either positively or negatively, and how we deal with, and moreover, how we use those issues. This can include early advice at a feasibility stage and the preparation of key planning documents, things like desk-based assessments, heritage impact statements, conservation management plans, and all that documentation that supports a planning application. As the projects move into the design stage, built heritage input generally becomes more focused on how existing structures can be adapted, can be reused, can be integrated. That might, well, and usually involves detailed measured surveys and the production of accurate drawings and 3D models to properly understand the fabric and function of a building and how that building works as a system with its surroundings. On site, the work can range for below ground archaeology, can range from non-intrusive surveys such as field walking, geophysical survey, topographic survey, all the way through to more intrusive techniques such as evaluation trenching, geoarchaeological sampling, and the excavation of archaeological remains. It really depends on what's required, and it can vary quite a lot from project to project. Importantly, archaeology generally also has a public-facing side to the work as well, through engagement, interpretation, and opening sites up to communities. And it really helps people connect with their history and their own past. Could I have my last slide, please? Archaeology is sometimes seen as a risk to programme, but in reality, this isn't the case. It's only risk when it's been overlooked and it hasn't been planned for. And the key really is timing. When heritage is considered early in a project, it allows teams to properly understand constraints, plan any necessary work, and build that work into the programme. Very similar to what you would do with, say, ground investigation or utility surveys. And that early insight very much reduces uncertainty and reduces risk. It means better informed design decisions, smoother planning processes, and fewer surprises when you actually get onto site. But beyond the just pragmatic risk management, it can also play a very positive role in shaping development. It can inform the design through retention of structures, materials, historic layouts, things like that. It can also help reinforce local identity and character, and it often creates opportunities for engagement, which can build support with local communities and stakeholders. So rather being a constraint, it's something that, when used well, can actively contribute to better places and better place making. Thank you. I will now pass you over to my colleagues Ollie and Katie to talk about specific case studies.
Hi there. So first of all, we're just going to look through some of these answers that have come in from everyone and see what they are. So yeah, so some people have suggested beads, bones, finger bones, bobbins, and kiln props. So I can in fact reveal that these are wig curlers, and this small selection of finds were recovered from a site in Bristol, which during the late 18th century was going through a real boom and there was a lot of wealth. And this particular site was in the affluent sort of suburbs of Bristol. We actually recovered 87 of these wig curlers. So we have a strong suspicion that this site may have been connected to wig making, or might have just been there might have just been a really posh residence nearby. So how it actually worked, it's a bit like a modern day curler. You'd wet the hair you'd use wet paper and you'd wrap the hair around these individual curlers, and then you'd fasten it all up and then put the wig in an oven and bake it to set the curls. So that's in fact how it worked. So we'll leave that to one side and move to the site I'm going to talk about today. So I'd like to talk about the Greengate regeneration area in Salford, and one site at its heart, Christchurch, which is now known as Greengate Park. This was founded in 1800, and this was once an important institution in early 19th century Salford. It played a major role in social reform, community welfare, and progressive politics, and even helped spark an early grassroots movement for vegetarianism. This all against the backdrop of rapid industrialisation. So much of what we actually know about this site comes from a book written by the councillor Derek Antrobus, and it's his detailed account that was published nearly 30 years ago that laid the foundation for our understanding. And this traces the origins of the Bible Christian movement until what had recently just been a vacant car park in Salford's historic core. So this site sits within the Greengate regeneration area, which has seen major transformation in recent years. This has seen surface car parks and derelict land replaced with high quality residential mixed use development, drawing people back to the area. So when the Greengate regeneration framework was adopted back in 2014, it was recognised from the outset that the former church and its burial ground were a significant constraint, but also a major archaeological asset. And for that reason, the land was earmarked early on as a future green space, both for the existing residents and the growing community. So more broadly, the framework aimed to weave new public spaces into an emerging high-rise district, while still celebrating the area's heritage. So keeping the medieval street pattern, supporting existing cultural venues like the Eagle Pub, and reinvigorating old buildings such as the Grade 2 star-listed former public baths on Collier Street. Now, fast forward to November 2023, the site reopened as a public park, and this was delivered by Renica. And for the first time in more than 150 years, visitors could once again enjoy a moment of quiet and discover the remarkable story of the church that once stood here. But go back a few years ago to 2019, it was a very different story. There was no real reason to enter the site, and there's almost nothing to indicate its historical significance. For most people, it's just a convenient place to ditch your car on the way into the city centre. People passed through here, but they rarely ever lingered, and they were completely unaware they were parking on a burial ground where they were potentially thousands of individuals. At night, the area became a magnet for antisocial behaviour, and it was a sad fate for such an important sort of institution. In contrast, if you'd have walked along King Street in the early 1800s, you'd have seen something completely different. Historic maps show a church set within a large graveyard with a public burial ground to the east and a small structure next to the steps from King Street, which we now know to have been the tomb of the church's founder, the Reverend Cowherd. Much of our interest really in the site stems and is centred on Cowherd. He moved to Manchester in the late 18th century, then a growing liberal city where he first encountered the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg. Inspired by these ideas, he established two churches, the first on Peter Street in 1792 and the second, our site, on King Street in 1800. Remarkably, he funded the whole venture himself, creating not just the chapel, but also a sizable boarding school. Cowherd became a pioneer of early social welfare, opening a public library, running soup kitchens, and providing free medical care. His church also offered free burials at a time when most people had to pay, and this was including for free burials for the poor. So it's really deeply embedded the institution in the local community. This engraving shows the church as it appeared in 1809, the year Cowherd delivered his famous sermon urging his followers to adopt vegetarianism. This brought him into direct conflict with his superiors, including another Swedenborgian reverend, and perhaps his harshest critic, Richard Hindmarsh, who sarcastically and rather cruelly dubbed the vegetarian chapel the beefsteak chapel, a name which stuck, probably much to the annoyance of Cowherd. This ultimately led him to form a new branch, the Bible Christians, and this helped. His ideas actually helped inspire later veggie advocates, including his successor in the church, Joseph Brotherton, another well-known and influential Salfordian, who is notably Salford's first MP. Cowherd died in 1816 and was buried on the site with a monument inscribed at his own request, all feared, none loved, and few understood. But he was far from alone. Registers and later accounts suggest that as many as 35,000 people may have been buried here, although that may be an overestimation. The scale of these burials became a major focus of our archaeological work in 2019. So much of the site's future use depended on understanding this. Our work began with archival research, drawing together existing studies, maps, accounts, and drawings to build up a detailed picture of the site. But for me, there was also an underlying question: how did somewhere so significant become almost completely forgotten? Well, by the late 1860s, the chapel had become so dilapidated that a new church was being built elsewhere, and the King Street site was leased as a timber yard. Then, in 1869, a serious incident unfolded. The new tenant cut an access road and sewer across the paupers' burial ground, and soil mixed with human remains was taken away and dumped on a tip in Broughton. Contemporary accounts describe how shallow the burials were, coffins laid down one above the other. It's a stark reminder of just how sensitive the site was. So you can see on the 1891 map, the church and burial ground were disused, and Cowherd's tomb was no longer shown. We think this was probably dismantled. Some memorials, however, must have survived. So a late 19th century survey of the graveyard was carried out, and we know then that a lot of those ledger stones and burial stones were being used as the timber yard surface. What wasn't known is had they survived the demolition of the church, its use as a later scrapyard, and finally use as a car park. By 2019, with major redevelopment underway around Greengate, there was still a huge question mark over this crucial plot of land and what it could contain. There could be up to thousands upon thousands of people buried there. So our first priority was to understand what survived and at what depth. An initial program of trenching tested assumptions from the historical records. So we dug 4 trenches across the footprint of the church, revealing brick walls, path, and heating ducts, but crucially, no burials. A narrow strip at the western end exposed a continuous surface of ledger stones with inscriptions on. And we used a machine to excavate the modern understanding, but everything else was carefully uncovered by hand. Not all the stones survived, but enough remained to open up a larger area. As a precaution in this matter, we took out a Ministry of Justice licence. Excavation did in fact confirm burials survived, but everything was recorded and then safely backfilled. To the east, beyond the dotted boundary on the OS map, was the Paupers Burial Ground, the Paul Burial Ground. We carried out some limited excavations here, and these did in fact show mass burials survived, some at a very shallow depth and others clearly disturbed by the 1869 desecration. No human remains were, however, removed during this process. Ultimately, the entire burial ground was exposed. Many photographs were taken and stitched together to create a high-resolution georectified image of the western burial ground. Each ledger stone was transcribed, allowing the team to match with the late 19th century survey carried out by Owen. This created for the first time a complete and exact plan of the burial ground and its locations. Archaeology has achieved what it set out to do. So it reconciled the historic record with what survived in the ground and established what burials remained and what depth, and provide an accurate measured plan to help turn the vision for this public park into reality. For me, this also demonstrates how archaeology can give developers insight they need to make informed decisions on complex sites, and to do so with genuine sensitivity and respect for the past. So new boundary walls were erected around the site, and these were engineered in a way that propped up the site and helped protect the burials beneath. Ground levels were raised, and a sensitive design that respected the original layout and access into the site was finalised. To top it off, we helped create an information panel so that visitors today can learn about the origins of this place. In the last slide, I've included some photographs taken during the work. So there's an early visit here of delegation of councillors that were visiting alongside Renneker, including Salford's mayor and Derek Androbus, who wrote the book on this chapel. And in the middle is a visitor from further afield. This is the Reverend Augustus Barber, who is a teacher at the New Church in America, which is a kind of descendant really of the Bible Christian movement. He was on a pilgrimage of Swedenborgian sites across Europe, and he met with myself and Derek to learn more about the site. And that kind of really shows that there's an international recognition of this site, even though it had been forgotten. And then, yeah, finally, some pictures of the people that are using the church today. I think for me, this case study brings into focus the story of this institution that once played a vital role in improving the daily lives of people in Salford. And I think we can see something of that in the public spaces that are now being created in Greengate as it's emerging. You know, these amenities that are being delivered by Renneker and the council. These are helping to create happier, healthier, more resilient places in today's Salford. So I'm now going to hand over to Katie, who's going to be talking about Alex's case study.
Oh, thanks, Ollie. Ollie's case study focused on below ground archaeology, but much of our work also involves built heritage, which leads us on to our next case study. So the former Cannon Brewery site in Sheffield was once home to the makers of the much-loved Stones Bitter. Brewing took place here for almost 140 years, with many of the buildings we see today dating from the mid-20th century. Since the brewery closed in 1999, the site has been stripped out and left derelict. However, the site is now stepping into a new phase of redevelopment led by Capital and Centric. The major regeneration scheme will transform the site into a vibrant mixed-use neighbourhood. A key part of that vision is retaining and restoring important non-designated heritage assets like the iconic water tower and the 1960s brew house. These heritage elements will sit alongside contemporary new buildings, creating an architectural blend that acknowledges the site's industrial past. In 2023, a planning condition required detailed archaeological recording of the site. This included a Historic England Level 3 building recording of all the brewery buildings, alongside a full gazetteer of fixtures and fittings. So Civic were appointed in 2024 to deliver this work, and a big part of our role was understanding what should be kept, identifying the features that really tell the story of the brewery, and also developing a clear strategy for their retention. Next slide, please. So to understand a bit more about the significance of the site, it's helpful to look at Sheffield's brewing history and the development of the area during the Industrial Revolution. From the mid-18th century, brewing became a major part of the city's industrial identity. Within a century, Sheffield had evolved into an important regional centre for beer production and was home to around 30 breweries. At the time, water supplies were often contaminated and beer was considered the safer option, so much so that beer breaks became a normal part of working life. Many breweries were established in Neepsend and Kelham Island, which were transforming into heavily industrialised areas during the 1820s. Kelham Island in particular became a centre of metalworking innovation, with a lot of Sheffield steelworks established in this area. It's also worth mentioning that Kelham Island was the first industrial conservation area in the country, which was designated in 1985. The boundary was recently extended to include Neepsend, bringing unlisted buildings like Cannon Brewery into the conservation area. Cannon Brewery's story begins with William Stones, who acquired the site in 1860, although he'd actually been brewing beer since the 1840s and had run the Kelham Tavern since in the 1850s. Next slide, please. By 1880, the business had expanded significantly, with maltings established in nearby towns. Historic mapping from 1890 shows an already well-developed site that included the original brew house and water tower, alongside back-to-back workers' housing and even a school. Over time, the brewery passed through several owners, eventually becoming part of Bass Charrington, who continued brewing Stones bitter at the site until its closure. Throughout the 20th century, the brewery was expanded and redeveloped to keep up to date with the most recent beer brewing technologies. By the end of the century, it had become a complex, multi-phase industrial site with everything from fermentation buildings to bottling stores and air conditioning buildings. Next slide, please. Very little survives from the original 1860s brewery. However, remains are visible within some of the existing structures. For example, remnants of the early brew house can be seen within the later grain store building. Historic photos show that this would have been a Georgian-inspired structure typical of brewery architecture at the time. Initially, there were plans to retain the grain store and earlier facade, but a structural survey found that this wasn't viable. We prepared a heritage statement to support the removal of the building and to provide advice on the design of the replacement building. The aim was to ensure that the new building still reflects the character and architecture of the site. Next slide, please. Another key surviving element is the late 19th century water tower. This is a real landmark on the site and will be repurposed as part of the development. The historic building recording found that few original fixtures and fittings survived within the building, but found that the water storage tank, handrail, platform, and window openings should all be retained. Next slide, please. By the 1950s, Stones had become one of the UK's major brewers. A series of strategic acquisitions rapidly expanded the business, allowing it to compete at a national scale. This growth was reflected on site with the construction of a new state-of-the-art brew house, which costed £500,000. Architecturally, it's a strong building with distinctive recessed windows, mosaic panels, and concrete detailing. These features are key to its character and will be carefully retained, although some elements, like the timber windows, will need sensitive heritage-led replacements. Next slide, please. Internally, the building included a malt store, a milling room, and a sugar store. All processes were fully automated to reduce manual labour and powered by an adjacent boiler house. The brewing hall is probably the most interesting room. This is set over 2 levels that are connected by a wide balustraded staircase and decorated in cream and blue tiles. The hall would have contained 4 huge copper vats, which would have been housed within the concrete cast circular voids. Next slide, please. As the new brew house took over, the original one became redundant and was rebuilt as a grain store. Its facade was defined by a series of recessed brick panels with a distinctive stairwell window facing Rutland Street. The rear elevation of the building is also shown on the slide, with the individual loading bays defined by concrete piers. Next slide, please. The new grain store supported different stages of the brewing process, from storage to loading. The basement was particularly significant as this contained 9 stone vaulted arches, which form part of the earliest phase of the brewery. We also found 2 fermentation vats, which were the only surviving pieces of brewery equipment within the site. We suggested repurposing these as sunken planters, helping to embed the site's history of beer production into the landscaping design. Next slide, please. Across the scheme, heritage features are being carefully integrated into the new development to reinforce the site's distinctive character and its brewing legacy. Some of the fixtures and fittings will remain in place, like the circular voids, concrete cast staircases, and water tank, while other elements will be reused in more creative ways. The landscaping design in particular has a theme based around the form of brewing vessels, which will likely feature items like the lift hoists, timber vats, and signage. Next slide, please. The proposed scheme, designed by architect Shed KM, takes clear inspiration from the existing buildings. It draws on the variety of building forms, materials, and window patterns that evolved over time. Current CGI images of the scheme show a blend of old and new buildings. In the image, we can see that the design of the replacement grain store takes influence from the mid-20th century building's appearance, including details of the concrete piers. Ultimately, Cannon Brewery shows how heritage can shape development in a meaningful way, creating a place with memory, character, and a strong sense of identity. It also highlights how the sensitive reuse of mid-20th century unlisted buildings helps secure their place as future heritage assets. I'm now going to hand over to Richard from Capital and Centric.
Thanks, Katie. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard from Capital and Centric. So I've been asked to come on board and have a chat with you guys about kind of a bit around how we select our sites, how we focus on heritage, and how we deal with heritage assets. We have gained very much a reputation as the developers who deal with these kinds of buildings. I'm actually sat in a listed mill as I'm talking to you as our head office. So I thought what I'd do is I'd give you a quick a bit of an overview of kind of some of our projects that fit within this realm, and then give a bit of an insight into kind of how we go about it via a case study, which is Weir Mill in Stockport. So I'll just get started. So Eyewitness Works, this is one of our schemes in Sheffield. So this is an old cutlery works, which we took on a few years back now, converted into 97 new homes. Really exciting types of structures that we get to work with. They create really fascinating kind of new home typologies that you just don't get when you set about designing new builds. It's an element of new build in the background, obviously, but these are predominantly 1-2 bedroom apartments with a few sort of interesting townhouse type duplexes as well. We try and celebrate all of the kind of heritage and culture of the town, not just the buildings themselves. So actually I like this image because when we first got hold of the building, we did a little art exhibition in there called The Valley of the Giants by an artist called Flem, who we then brought back to do this really interesting mural on the side of the building, as well as kind of like a final piece to the puzzle. Always focusing on nice, exciting kind of verdant green landscaping as well, so we can create these really nice little spaces to spend on with the backdrop of these great heritage assets. Nice sort of shots of how we get these really, really fascinating, really nice internal shots, very different to what you'd imagine as your typical new build. And then very different scheme altogether. So this is Littlewoods. This is on Edge Lane in Liverpool. So this was actually once upon a time the home of the Pools, albeit since then it has done a number of different roles as well. Spent a lot of time making parachutes during the war and all sorts of different things. Interesting structure to try and convert into what you typically imagine developers to do on residential. So we are turning this into a film studio instead. With an element of education, which is a fantastic resource for Liverpool. So we do focus on not just the asset itself, but what can it do economically for the local community. But this is one of those projects where you take an absolutely fascinating building and create something really different and exciting about it. And actually, long term, we hope to have kind of all sorts of events and things to allow the public to come in and experience these spaces as well. It won't just be for the people who work there, it'll be for people who want to come and visit. Campus as well, just for those who are in Manchester, if you know campus very well. So this is a really interesting scheme. Again, it gives you a bit of an insight into how we approach schemes, not just from what you would typically see as heritage, being, you know, lots of listed mills, which we do a lot of. But interestingly, on this one, this was the old Manchester Metropolitan University campus. We wanted to try and do something a bit more interesting with some of the existing structures. So this is actually a sort of 1950s concrete structure where we took the facade off, kept the frame, and actually what it's given us is internally these beautiful kind of waffle grid ceilings in the apartments that have been exposed. So again, it's just kind of bringing a bit of the slightly different form of heritage back into those apartments. But alongside that, we also have your more traditional listed mill buildings as well. So that's what these two buildings look like, the kind of black corrugated timber and the brick buildings to the right. Actually, again, not really heritage, but kind of quite a cool little asset is the old security hut that's been made into this kind of really cool little exciting pop-up space too. As you can see in the background there, that actually is the original concrete structure with its new facade on. So kind of keeps a little bit of the original architectural intent, but making it look far more contemporary, and then beautiful green spaces in between again. And then Weir Mill. So we take all of that kind of knowledge and expertise. And one of the questions posed to me was, well, why do you go for heritage assets? How do you get involved in those? So actually, Weir Mill was an interesting scheme for us. So having done a lot of that kind of previous work, we were engaged with Stockport Council, who have the Mayoral Development Corporation, which is a regeneration function for the council, to really kind of push redevelopment within Stockport. And interestingly, this particular scheme, we were kind of asked, well, you guys have got plenty of heritage knowledge and experience and expertise. Can you help us out with a particular site? So for those who don't know, where it says Mersey Way and Red Rock there, that is the town centre effect. That's your retail, main high street part of the town. And I don't think you can see my cursor now, which is going to trip me up a bit, but I'll try my best to explain it. Where the yellow and pink areas kind of meet, that is the A6. And it's quite a hard line that cuts straight through the middle of Stockport. But there is a slight pedestrian route underneath there that takes you off to the interchange and Weir Mill, if you can see it, almost kind of central, slightly to the top. And then you're almost immediately hit from there then with the viaduct that cuts across, and all around there, lots of private land ownership and only a couple of places to actually penetrate through the viaduct to get you to what is the Town Centre West master plan. So as you come along the river, Weir Mill becomes this really key gateway into this wider regeneration part of the town for the council. And so they came to us and said, we have got a private landowner, we have got something kind of in for planning, not really what we wanted, what can you do? So we came along and had a look at this scheme. This is a great shot of Weir Mill. This gives you kind of an idea of all the different components. You have the original mill building itself. You have kind of some of these ancillary spaces, this two-story space in the front, and you can also see the viaduct kind of cutting across in the background too. So we've obviously got a track record of dealing with these types of buildings. And one of the biggest things here is it's a listed mill that actually goes underneath a listed viaduct, as well as all the other ancillary buildings. So it's really important to make sure that on this one, it's not just a case of a refurb. We've got to really think about this. This is a key heritage asset. And I actually not too far from Stockport, and I know the importance of the viaduct and how it appears on pretty much anything to do with Stockport. So really important to start to have a look at perhaps how we engage with the community. This is a really big part of what we do. So making sure that we get in and we actually talk to the people of the towns and the cities that we work in. This was a really interesting event where we worked with a local events operator, Foodie Friday. If anybody's from Stockport, I'm sure they've been to a Foodie Friday event. The idea was a bit of food, music, kind of nice day out, but actually smack in the middle of lockdown. It was that weird bit in September when we were allowed to do events outside as long as they're socially distanced. So we took advantage of that. We had 300 people come down and chat to us about their experience and kind of interest in the site, give us a bit of a local heritage as well, which is when we found a little bit more about Lowry's interest with it in Stockport and obviously the industrial kind of nature of a lot of his art. This was a great photograph of the man himself, stood there with Weir Mill just in the distance, kind of underneath the archway. So you start to appreciate there are some key views, not just the buildings themselves, but there's a lot more to heritage than just the physical building. There's a lot about how it sits within the townscape, which is a big part of our planning application. This is a great shot. I love this one because this gives you the other kind of challenges, which you've got the River Mersey nearby, and you can see where the building goes underneath the viaduct. And actually, Weir Mill was there before the extension to the viaduct. So in the sort of mid 19th century, when the East Mill was built, it was built plenty of space. A little bit later, when the extension came on, they actually had to take down part of the mill and rebuild it slightly narrower underneath the archway for the viaduct, which creates, again, some really exciting heritage sort of views. If you go into some of the apartments and look out now, you have this great kind of archway of the viaduct as your sort of frame to the view, which is fantastic. Another nice thing about this is it shows you the wheelhouse. Now, the reason Weir Mill got its listing was actually because it was one of the best examples in the UK of the movement from water power to steam power in the cotton industry. That was its listing. So again, we've got to take a lot of time to understand that and have a look at, well, how do we come in here now and repurpose this? You can see from the photographs it was in a pretty bad state of repair. The wheelhouse obviously being boarded up, the wheel itself was gone, a lot of rot, a lot of decay to the timber structures inside. So how do we kind of get hold of that and make sure we maintain as much as we possibly can and keep that heritage without letting it fall to rack and ruin? So a big part of that really is to have a look at what else is there. These are obviously kind of some of the key internal shots. The mills, plenty of examples of this all over Manchester and well, towns and cities across the UK, to be fair, of how these suit really nicely for residential conversion. But we need to make sure that we're looking at this a little bit more holistically. If we're going to be potentially losing some of the parts of the building, there's got to be for good reason. So we need to make sure we do plenty of optioneering and have a look at all the different viable solutions. And essentially where we settled on was a cross between predominantly residential, but trying to retain some of those interesting spaces that were created by that evolution for commercial and retail, so that people can still come in and visit it, and actually they get access to the more exciting parts of the scheme, albeit actually pretty much every bit of these mills are absolutely beautiful. This is a really cool bit. So I love showing people this image because this was actually originally earmarked for demolition. When we walked into this space, and it was quite an interesting route to get there, a few shady characters floating around at the time, felt very dangerous and a bit unsafe to get yourself in there, but really exciting space when you come into it, albeit it doesn't look great there, with these great kind of skylights. And the reality is we can't get these kinds of spaces. You wouldn't design them, they're too difficult to build these days. So we looked at this straight away and thought there's got to be something exciting we can do with this. And I will show you an image of that a little bit later on. So this is where we end up. So unfortunately, we did lose a few of the buildings. As we went through, we found these larger spaces that do work for commercial and retail, but there were a number of smaller kind of functional buildings that couldn't be repurposed into anything else. And the reality of the cost of doing some of these types of regeneration schemes is that actually you do need an element of simpler new build, that kind of the value that's created there offsets some of the losses that you potentially make on these refurbishment projects. Particularly as time goes on, it's getting more and more expensive and more difficult to deal with these types of assets. So it takes a lot of collaboration between all the parties to understand, okay, from a heritage perspective, we don't want to touch anything. But in reality, if this isn't going to fall into disrepair, what can we do? What do we need to do? So it was a bit of a difficult process. We had lots of conversations with heritage officers, and I think we came up with what is ultimately the best possible solution, where we have an element of new build to the sort of southern side of the site and the two mills and that triangular west shed, as we call it. over to the left, and the little box just poking out the top is the wheelhouse that sits in the River Mersey. So this was our plan. What do we do with it? So let's create this really exciting new space. If we're going to lose some buildings, let's make sure it's at least worth it, and we can create somewhere for people to come down to, a new destination and a new part of the town, not just literally a refurb of those buildings. There's some great ideas for activating the river with a pontoon, and then we spent a bit of time over the winter stood there looking at the River Mersey and thinking, in reality, those people in those kayaks will be in Liverpool pretty quickly. So perhaps a pontoon's not the ideal solution for this particular site, but still a really active river frontage. So again, it creates a place for people to come down. Again, talking about heritage, and Mersey is a really important part of the history of Stockport. But actually, if you ever come to Stockport, it's really difficult to engage with the Mersey in its town centre, because the Mersey Way shopping centre was built over the top, and the river got culverted straight through the middle of Stockport. So this is creating a new place where people can come down and experience the river in a more sort of social environment. And then this is again looking and showing you the two different types of construction we've got on site. We've got the refurb and we've got the modern construction. We made a very deliberate point here to not try and mimic what was already on site. It's important to celebrate it and appreciate it for what it is, and not try and recreate the same thing next door. We just don't have the skill sets, we don't have the budgets, we don't have the technologies to be able to deliver these fantastic buildings, and it would be wrong to try and copy something that's so characterful. So very deliberate modern extension. And then the lower level, that single story space, is that the unit I showed you earlier that we walked into with the really cool skylights. Here we are again. So this was that space, and here are our plans for it. So we thought, you know what a fantastic place we could start to create this kind of all day space for people to come down, get your breakfast in the mornings, get your dinner on the way home. It becomes this really kind of flexible, exciting commercial offer where everybody can get in now and start to experience it. It has this really cool kind of open space all the way down the front of the mill. So actually, if you're stood at where the bar is there, you would literally look up through a great big skylight up the side of the mill building, which is it's an incredible viewpoint. And then also then looking at, apologies, we got it. Yep, it's back on. So then looking at kind of the central spaces as well, these courtyards, putting little nods to some of the original heritage. So actually that space in the middle there is probably quite an elaborate attempt at denoting a chimney, but it shows the original footprint of where the original chimney would have sat. And then we're looking at kind of putting a pizza oven in there to have smoke and things coming out of there, which is all a nice idea. But again, beautiful verdant spaces, places where people are going to want to come in. And what was great here is now we get this new way to come in and interact with this great structure, which is the viaduct, which most people only see from a distance throughout Stockport. Water frontage, and creating these great accesses through so that we can kind of hover over the water and get these really interesting new views of the site and of the spaces. And then this is a great shot again, showing kind of the taller element of the scheme to give a real marker for this new part of the town centre, but being as sympathetic as we can, keeping it narrow, trying to block as little of the viaducts as possible. And then at the lower level, we have what we call Weaver Square, which is actually one of the old buildings that we did have to get rid of. But we decided, actually, do you know what? Let's create this great kind of outdoor space where we can have events, we can hold markets, we can have an opportunity to bring people down. And in the landscaping, what we've done is we've brought back all of the columns that were saved from the building and created almost kind of this giant pergola throughout the space that denotes the position of the old building. And we've even kept part of the wall as kind of the safety, I suppose, against the river. Rather than demolish it and replace it with some kind of iron balustrade, we've just kept the wall there instead. So you get a real kind of sense of there was originally another building here. So again, it's just trying to find those different uses and how we kind of incorporate that as much as possible. And then this is where we are today. So a few images of kind of how we're getting on. Now we're almost finished, so we're due to PC here sometime around sort of early summer. But the reason I thought Weir Mill is such an important site to kind of put on here is it just demonstrates how challenging these sites are, how it's important to get in there and understand the relationship that these places have with the local community, understand that from not only just a heritage perspective, but from a personal perspective. And you learn these really exciting, interesting things. But also when you start to really explore them, play with them, you create these really exciting new sort of spaces like the West Shed that, again, you just wouldn't see if we were doing a traditional new build development. planning has been really, really tricky. So actually what's been great is by spending some time with the planners, spending some time with the community, we've come up with these great ideas like this structure in front of you here, which again just keeps the original footprint of that building still present. People can go down there and still experience it, but it creates this whole new part of town where you can really engage with that great big viaduct. So as I say, real main reason for kind of bringing this project on here was just to kind of give everybody a bit of an insight into us as developers. Why would we go for those types of assets? What is it we start to look at, and how do we go about developing it? It's difficult, it's complicated, but actually well worth it when you get these kinds of schemes as your sort of your pipeline.
Thanks so much, Richard. It was so good to hear more about Weir Mill and have that visit. I know we're going to hear from you again really soon during our wider conversation, and I know some questions already rolling in for you. So it's now time for us to do our second Guess the Find. Exciting moment. So I think a slide is coming, and we're going to. So here it is from a former industrial site in Manchester. Take a good look. What do you think this is? Why was it made? What was its purpose, or what formed it? And I mean, I certainly do not know. A child's toy, first one in from Lucy. So keep those guesses, glass cows, in the chat coming in. The answer will be revealed shortly. So what is this second find? Nice bit of archaeology there for us to guess at. And in the meantime, while you get your questions in, I'm going to bring in Louise. Louise Brennan is Director of Region at Historic England and is going to join me on stage. Hi, Louise.
Hi.
So you've been sitting backstage listening to all these speakers, and I mean, I really want to turn to you for your reflections on what you've heard today and the role of Historic England, and maybe a little bit of myth busting as well. But why don't you talk a little bit about the role and maybe some misconceptions about that relationship with Historic England? And when we talk about this being tough work, it's often spoken about as though these conversations are difficult, these projects are difficult, and you can maybe shine a light on why that perception exists, and maybe how to make that a little easier.
So I think there's two ways that heritage projects can be seen as difficult. There's, first of all, which what Richard was demonstrating, is that some of these heritage sites are hugely complicated. Sometimes they're in really poor condition. And it's generally my experience that when you get on site with a heritage site, it is very rarely in better condition than you thought. It is generally in worse condition than you thought when you've got something that's been on the Heritage at Risk Register for a long time or left to decay, as we could see with Weir Mill. So there's the kind of very practical economic side of things as to why heritage projects can be seen difficult, because sometimes they are more expensive, or they require greater ingenuity and creativity to get the best out of them. And I think you could really see that with Weir Mill. And I think that there's the other side of it is a perception that those of us who work in the heritage sector are going to be really difficult and don't want you to do anything to that heritage site, and would insist on Richard keeping every single little bit of Weir Mill and not touching it, so that we're very sort of protectionist. And that is a myth. I've worked for Historic England now for a really long time. It's not quite 1899, which is what my kids say, but I did join the organization in 1999. So I have been here for a long time. And I think what I've seen over the years is that our engagement with developers has really massively improved. And what Historic England really wants to see is early engagement with developers. And we will work with you to find solutions so that you can achieve something that you could see at Cannon Brewery or you could see at Weir Mill. I mean, Weir Mill, looking at those images and hearing Richard talk about it, I just thought, wow, this is a fabulous place to live. It's a fabulous place to go and hang out. I would love to have a pizza from that slightly scary looking pizza oven in the middle of the mill. But, you know, I think that is one of the myths that Historic England wants to stop people doing things. We do not. Historic buildings only carry on being relevant for people if they are reused and people are enjoying them. And that is the joy of doing this kind of work. So I think there's that myth that we need to bust and address.
So it feels like every consultant says, just bring us in earlier, like Landscape Voice says, just bring us in at the beginning. The heritage consultants and archaeologists say, bring us in early. I mean, I guess the question is, okay, if we do start this conversation early, how early is that conversation? Is it before you even acquire the site, or is it like the minute that at what point do you engage? And what does a good early conversation look like? Because it's one thing to kind of have that early conversation, but what does good look like? Mm-hmm.
Well, I've had plenty of conversations with developers or potential owners before they bought something. So when they're really wanting to test out, are their ideas viable? Are they going to hit problems? Should they buy? Because once you've bought it, that is a big commitment. You've got it then. So if your proposal was, I don't know, to demolish the whole thing and it's listed, and then you talk to Historic England and the local planning authority and we say we've got a problem with that, you've already bought it. So I've had lots of really early discussions with people before they've purchased something. But equally, sometimes people, owners have got something, they don't know quite what to do with it. And again, we're there to have a really early conversation. What does a good conversation look like? Oh, I mean, one of those rooms where the lights go. But
That's good.
So what does a good conversation look like? A good conversation is really frank, really honest, early doors. You want to involve the local planning authority because obviously they are the decision maker, not Historic England. Involve Historic England. If it's helpful, it's useful, it's going to come to us anyway. And really think about what are the issues, and the best discussions and the best projects I've ever worked on, it's you're part of a team together and you're thinking about what is it you want to achieve. We really understand, your business model. What are you trying to do? We understand the issues of viability, and we're thinking about what are the creative ways that you can achieve what you need to do. So if it's a residential conversion, what are the ways you can do it? What are the issues? What are the things that we can help you consider? One of the benefits of involving Historic England Early Doors is obviously we're a national organisation, so we've got national experience. So we've worked on projects all over England, so we might have some good ideas from how they did it over there that you could potentially apply to here. And we also, we're really well networked. We know lots of people, so we know all the local planning authorities, we know different partners. And if there's a potential question of grant, which sometimes there is, then we might know the funders who you could talk to. So best conversations are when you feel like you're all in it together and your aim is what's the best outcome for this heritage asset and the community who care about it. And that is a lot of fun, frankly, as well.
And that means coming to that conversation, not thinking, oh, what a pain, I need to talk to you. It's thinking, I want to collaborate with you. Yeah, I want to get the best of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sorry, go ahead. And those shared outcomes, like having a shared, desire for.
And I was just thinking of a recent case I was dealing with in Derby where the developer didn't involve us early on. There were all sorts of issues. And when we finally did sit down to have a conversation, it was a sort of revelation on both sides. We were like, yes, we're trying to achieve the same thing. We got on really well, and lo and behold, we managed to work together, come up with a scheme which has now got consent and which they're starting to implement. So when you do sit down together and have a conversation, it's normally most of the time really fruitful and you feel like you're pulling together.
I guess, is there anything, we're having that early conversation, it's going well. Is there anything that you've experienced in terms of, we're going to talk a little bit about communities and the community around it. But I guess, like, is it often the case that what matters to the community differs to what matters from historic England? Like, can you have sites that have a little value to people
Mm.
that are of great value to historic England, or vice versa? Or is that
I mean,
relationship
in
straightforward?
most, in the majority of cases, local communities really care about their heritage. I think what you might see is that traditionally it might be considered that historic England is more bothered about the grade 1 listed, the grade 2 star listed, the most significant things. Where of course local communities can be equally bothered about the building that isn't listed, but is a really important building on their high street where perhaps, they had great memories where they went and, met people, hung out, great times, and they could be as bothered about that as they will be that is something really significant. So a good example is the Coles building in Sheffield, which Richard might be familiar with. That for me personally, that was a building that, I'm married to a Sheffield man, so it was always, you went to John Lewis and Coles for absolutely everything you needed. And I can remember, my first baby was a really difficult baby. She did not want a nap or anything. And when I was on maternity leave, going to Coles in Sheffield was kind of my happy place. So for me, that building, even though it's grade 2 listed, has huge sort of sentimental value in my mind as sort of, as a place that I went, an important part of my life. And I think that is what you do sometimes see with communities. So something might not be listed, or it might not be the most significant building in their place, but for them it's really important. Cinemas are often a good example of those sort of, that's where Granny and Grandad met, and all those kinds of things. So pubs, people they really care about pubs, and they really care when pubs close. So local communities will care about things that might not necessarily be the most significant. But I think we as an organisation really recognise that now. And one of the really nice things about the Heritage at Risk Capital Fund, which I'm overseeing at the moment, is that we had a much wider eligibility criteria. So we were able to fund things that were grade 2 listed or undesignated. And so you saw a really wide range of community projects coming forward.
I can see questions are rolling in, so I'm going to bring the whole team, all our speakers, back to stage now to start to answer that. And thanks so much, Louise, for your insights, but I hope they continue because you're going to be part of this next conversation too, as we've got more coming in. But as everyone joins us, I think we're also going to find out what that guess the find is. So hopefully Ollie's going to have a big reveal. We've had some really great feedback so far. An early prosthetic or bone replacement, spiritual symbols. Ollie, do you want to tell us about what we've got here?
I think I'm talking now. Can you hear me?
You are.
Yeah.
Yes, I can
Yeah.
hear
So
you.
this lovely little object that fits so nicely in your hand, in the palm of your hand. This was a piece of made from amber-coloured glass, and it came from Ancoats of all places. So really one of Manchester's success stories, Ancoats, in terms of regeneration and heritage. An area probably more famous for its connection with the cotton industry, but probably less well known is it was a hub for Manchester's glass production in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This came from a production site of Birtles Tate & Co., who were one of those famous Manchester glassmakers. And this is actually not one of the things that they would have sold, but something that was made with leftover glass at the end of the day. It's an object known as a frigga, and we think that this is meant to look like a pig, and it was sort of they'd make these sort of playthings at the end of the day to demonstrate their skill, but also just to kind of take home pieces. And I like to think that maybe this was destined to take home to give to their child or something. But it's just quite a nice playful thing, and it provides like a nice connection with Manchester's glass industry, which is extinct now, but was once a really important part of people's lives in Ancoats. So that's what that is.
Wow. So I guess the closest, a few people guessed that it was a glass cow. I guess they were really the closest
Yeah.
we had, really.
I mean, I guess it's still open to interpretation what animal it's meant to be, but it's got quite big ears and quite a pronounced snout, so we think it's meant to be a pig. But yeah.
So how you figure out that it's a plaything and doesn't have any useful purpose is another question altogether. Would that be because you've seen it elsewhere and you kind of know what this might look like, or?
Well, the type of glass that they were making on this particular site was pressed glass, so this doesn't really fit with their sort of repertoire of objects that they were making at that site. And yeah, the kind of the process of making these friggers, as they were called, I've not made that word up, at the end of the day, is quite well documented. So often they'd make things like ornate glass walking canes, which are not meant to be used, but they twist the glass in particular ways and thread in different colours and things. And this was obviously just clearly someone having a bit of a mess about at the end of the day, which is quite nice.
It's like glassmaker flexing at the end of the day. It's
Yeah,
like
I mean, God, they've been really exhausted, but they obviously still found time to do this. But
we'll do anything for our kids. Maybe they were
yeah, maybe.
plaything seems like. Yeah. Well, we've got some questions, so welcome back. I know we've got Richard and Graham and Katie and Ollie here as well, and there's a bunch of questions that are rolling in. I'm going to start around this question about getting the right kind of developer and site owner involved with heritage sites to get rid of those who don't get it. I feel like that's one for you, Richard, to start with. Really, is like it is important to have heritage, the right kind of developer, but I guess what makes you the right kind of developer? Like how do you mitigate that risk, or that risk profile, or how do you be the right developer with the right funding to be able to work this way?
Yeah, interesting question. I think, having the right track record, putting the right things first. So as a business, so we call ourselves a social impact developer. What that really means is we have to have a lasting social impact on any of the projects that we touch. So we won't, for example, just get a plot of land in the middle of town and build a relatively square new build box on there. We want to make sure that we could come back here in 50 years, 100 years time, we could still see that we have had a positive impact on the areas in which we operate. And that is, it's a fundamental part of our MO. We won't deviate away from that. There's lots of different ways we do it, but a big part of it is heritage assets. Brownfield land's a similar one, but generally heritage assets from that perspective. So that's one thing. It's ingrained in our DNA in terms of how we approach certain projects. But also we're very design focused and design led. So even when we do end up with a new build, what we don't do is bog standard, and we also don't change our design ethos when we go from different towns to different towns. Across the UK, building a building can cost the same, but be worth considerably less in one place to another. So viability is always a challenge. So organizations like Historic England then help out. So we tend to find that, again, having that right attitude, having the right approach that we've proven and demonstrated, tends to sit us slightly more to the front of the list of developers that those types of organizations would like to work with as well. And I think once you've gone through it and demonstrated that is genuinely how we approach development, then our word is a bit more than others maybe when we're having these conversations. So I think inevitably, particularly when it's local authorities, they come to us knowing we've already done it, rather than just saying, oh yeah, on this particular scheme, trust us, it will be fine. We have got a track record there to demonstrate we've put design and heritage before necessarily profit and cost.
There's a couple specific questions for you could probably answer quickly. Mike Kirk, who's chair of the group board at Hyde Housing, wants to know what proportion of the homes developed are social and affordable. I assume that's at Weir Mill. And secondly, Mike Waddington, who's an architect at Waddington Architects, wants to know, was there a connection with slavery, and was that part of heritage thinking at Weir Mill? So I wonder if you can answer those specific ones.
Sure. So it's a little bit similar. So Mike, to pick up on your question, specifically at Weir Mill, none, because of the viability challenge that's gone on there, but it varies from site to site. So for example, we've got a scheme down in Cambridgeshire, not Cambridge, where we're delivering 50% affordable housing. So It depends. Again, it really is viability led. You know, buildings cost a lot of money to build. If the values are not there, then typically that's where the affordable housing falls away. Unfortunately, that tends to then be the areas where it's probably more needed. But then that's when we do then start to partner with other organisations like Homes England to then try and see if we can find ways to plug viability gaps from a different angle to deliver more. Our honest view is we would put as much in as we could. It's just about making sure that those numbers stack. So it genuinely varies from site to site. In terms of slavery, no is the quick answer to that question. We didn't consider anything to do with slavery. In all honesty, there was plenty to go at already from a heritage perspective, given the tie to the local industry, the significance from that evolution of technology. There was plenty to look at already from there.
So, Louise, there's a question here for you, which is from Jordan Paris, Archaeology Project Management Apprentice at Rochelle Development Agency. Who's best to contact at Historic England for advice on plans and historic buildings on the Heritage at Risk Register? So where do you start?
Well, if it's a site-specific answer, your regional offices are the best port of call, and all our contact details are on the Historic England website. So we have regional offices spread throughout England, and those staff will have really, really good local knowledge of, you know, different assets on the Heritage at Risk Register, who are the people who would be interested in them, who should you talk to. So definitely the regional offices are the best port of call if it's a specific site that you're interested in. If it was like a national question about heritage at risk as a theme, then again, there's a general contact detail on our internet, on the website, and then that would get sent through to the right person internally.
So that's a helpful shorthand for, I mean, go to the website and look at, we've got a thank you from Jordan. So that's like a nice and specific. I mean, I want to dig into that idea of good relationships, good collaboration, and maybe that's a good one for Graham. Like, what does that look like from your perspective? I mean, you might say we need to be brought in early, but what relationships work best when it comes to, you know, having these projects run smoothly, having them connect and with communities, and maybe a little bit about that relationship to community engagement. I mean, when do you bring archaeology into that conversation with communities? You know, how can it be used to foster that sense of place and belonging? So, Graham, over to you.
It's well, that's quite a complicated question. It's a lot of the time it will very much depend on the development itself. So some projects, archaeologically speaking, might not really be appropriate. Or in fact, some stages of a development might not be particularly appropriate to bring in community engagement. Usually the stuff at the very start, maybe you're doing a trial trenching evaluation. You just can't really do it effectively. But I think my two answers there would be it's a conversation that you want to have with the main developer, probably, as we keep saying, very early on. Some sites have huge potential for community involvement, but you often get some developers might not realize that, or it might not even occur, you know, because a lot of people are just thinking, well, I've got to fulfill my planning conditions. But, you know, rather than saying, yes, okay, we've got one element of heritage where we have to do this. But what they want to take into account is there's the other element, as well as doing what you have to do. Can we use it in some way to enhance what we're doing, enhance the development, bring the community in, and just basically just do something positive? And quite a lot of times it is possible. So we have to have that conversation early on, and we can look at what different elements there are and how we can, you know, how we can do it. There's such a broad range of community engagement that it's just something that needs to be talked about, I think, early on and built into the program.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting, I mean, Ollie, you spoke about your you know, it's quite sensitive, like a grave site that has so many people and connections to people's, you know, kind of ancestry. And then also, I mean, is it is that how do you bring those findings, and what are the sensitivities around that process of discovery, and are you having an ongoing conversation with the community during that process, or is it very much like there's a fence around it and this is a quiet moment for findings and then afterwards?
Yeah, well, the exposure of human remains, dictates that you kind of have to do that behind closed doors, just so that you don't cause unwanted harm, and that's kind of a legal consideration. I guess with that site though, we've kind of brought together this kind of unprecedented data set where people, like you could say, could research there are people that are buried at the site. So that would be a great community engagement project that could happen after, well, at any point after the development's taken place. There's other sites, so you kind of have that opportunity in the hiatus, I suppose, between us doing the investigation and development kicking off, where you can bring people into the sites. We had a site of Prestwich's town yard and fire station, which was being as one of its kind of regeneration areas in Prestwich, and we had an open day on Saturday. Hundreds of people came down to see the remains, and that was really nice. They were exposed at a really shallow depth, so they could actually walk within the rooms of the old stables and things like that. And that provided a really nice connection with this building that had been demolished 50 or 60 years ago. Some people could still remember.
We've got a great question, and sorry, go ahead. Finish your thought.
And then sometimes maybe what we find isn't particularly interesting to everyone, but we were digging a foundry site in next to Capital and Centric's main offices in Manchester, on their site called Ferris, and in the process of research found out that the descendant of the foundry owner still alive, and we invited him to come and visit the site. So he was the only visitor, but I think that was quite poignant as well. And there were things that we learned from him, and he really cherished that moment to go back to the foundry where he'd actually walk around when he was a kid. So that was nice. And yeah, I think there's different levels of interaction you can create, especially when you've got that kind of cooperation with the developer.
There's a question that's come in from Lucy O'Leary, who is communications assistant at Civic. So you, Ollie and Graham, you know her clearly. But about what makes a late 20th century building heritage worthy. And I mean, certainly Richard over at campus, I mean, it may not have been, listed in any way, but you certainly tapped into some of those 20th century elements. But perhaps Louise, I'll start with you. I mean, does Historic England see 20th century buildings as heritage worthy, and what would qualify?
So this question was focused on late 20th century, and then you get into listing rules. So if you think of identifying heritage value as identifying something through listing, there are quite strict rules of a newer building. So you have the 30-year rule, which is, something you can't list something that is younger than 30 years old. But then even when you get past that date, and so the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, very, very selective about, what would actually hit that criteria for listing. So for really young buildings, it's got to be absolutely exceptional in terms of architectural and historic interest. So there might not be that many late 20th century buildings that would hit that. I think as you get back, and certainly if you get to mid-century, I think mid-century has had a real sort of revival and a flourishing of understanding of what is significant. And I was really interested looking at Katie's presentation on Cannon Brewery, that many of the buildings there were what we'd call mid-century modern, so the big brewery building. And actually looking at that now, that's actually looks like a really elegant building, and there's some really nice detailing there in terms of those tiles, the staircases. And I think it's the sort of building that when I was young, So in the 80s or even the early 90s, people would have been quite dismissive of. And I think now our understanding has developed about, the investment in terms of materials and the craft and that laid back, pared back style. I think so. Our understanding of mid-century is definitely a lot of those buildings we would now consider to be heritage worthy. And also, I think that point that I was making earlier about community, what do people feel about them? What are the memories that people made in places like that? That is another aspect of heritage. And then, there's also the embodied carbon you get in some of these buildings. And obviously the most sustainable building is the building that is already there, which is why it's so great to see Capita and Centric doing that work at Cannon Brewery and saving some and repurposing some of those buildings that, perhaps even 20 years ago, we would have, the assumption would have been that they should be demolished. So I think our understanding of this heritage is always evolving.
Yeah, and I think that would be nice to bring you in, Richard, to talk about it. Obviously you saved some buildings at campus that, um, that were kind of would be considered not significant, on any level of register. And I know it's really central to the stories that you tell about the places that you created. It'd be nice to hear about that kind of narrative quality of those buildings and how you identify that. Really, it's not a classic metric of heritage. There's probably not people saying, "Can you please save this, you know, folly from a parking lot?" But yeah, if you could speak a little bit about the story value and how you identify it and those late 20th century elements.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned parking lot. We're actually doing a car park in Newcastle under Lyme at the minute, turning that into apartments. I think the first one in the UK. So it's an interesting scheme. So I think from our perspective, Louise has just taken a phrase that we throw out quite a lot about the most sustainable building you've got. The most sustainable building is usually the one you've already got. And I think that's a really, really important point. If there's a massive concrete structure that exists, to demolish it and build another concrete structure does seem a little bit bonkers, quite frankly, if it can be repurposed. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. And I'll give you an example. Actually, at Weir Mill, one of the biggest problems we had there is the depth of some of the buildings. So when they've been used for industrial purposes, they're quite often very, very deep buildings because they have large machinery or manufacturing lines, etc. So you can only, if you start to create living spaces in there, you either create great big holes in the middle to let daylight in, or ultimately they become really long, deep, dark homes. So they're not always appropriate for that. But as I showed you with Littlewoods, that doesn't necessarily mean it can't be retained. But there's a lot of kind of effort that goes into that. And I think from our perspective, we come across buildings all the time actually that aren't listed, that should be listed. We looked at a scheme in a town in the Midlands, which was an old library that's been earmarked for demolition now, which is a real shame because actually I'm gonna make myself look very stupid here, but I can't remember the name of the architect who did the cathedral in Liverpool. However, it was one of his buildings as well that was done and has been earmarked for demolition, and I think it's a terrible waste that is the approach that's taken. And I think actually a lot of people like the kind of the comfort and aesthetic of being in something that already existed. I think new builds can be quite austere and a little bit harsh in a lot of cases. It's very difficult to create a sense of kind of quality in a lot of cases without having to add quite a lot to a new build. And I think there's lots of benefits to that. There's, new buildings can be quite a lot more sustainable. They can be far better performing from an energy perspective. But it does take quite a lot then to add on to it to make it feel really exciting. Whereas actually some of these existing structures are already pretty cool. I mean, I'm looking at Ollie there with that massive stone behind him. And I think it's a great example of actually creating some really interesting kind of spaces to be in by expressing and celebrating the structure that holds the building up. It doesn't have to always be this kind of nice latest, whatever the latest interior design fad may be at a particular time. So making something of the existing structure is often, a really, really great way to kind of introduce some kind of texture and some kind of interest these apartments, into these homes, into these workspaces. So yeah, we've done a scheme over in Wigan, which is the Civic building, which was the old council offices that was earmarked for demolition. And we went in there. It was quite fantastic. Funny that we need the sort of timber shuttering effect that was quite popular probably 10, 15 years ago now on concrete is everywhere in that building. And yet it was going to be demolished, and somebody not too long ago would have paid an absolute fortune to create that exact same kind of architectural texture. So we find that these older buildings, even very not as much necessarily late century, but mid-century of the 20th century, there is these really interesting kind of concrete frames and structures that just have a really interesting aesthetic purely because of the way they were made. And so we like to kind of celebrate that as much as we can.
Character. We would call it character, wouldn't we? The character of the building.
Absolutely.
There's a question here from Edward, who's associate panel member at Frame Projects, about the draft NPPF and DPPPG. And do they go far enough to promote or insist on a process in which developers, plan makers, and land promoters should follow? So I want to speak to you, Louise, about the draft NPPF. What is the role? Are we happy with are you happy, or is Historic England happy with the role of heritage and how it's expressed in there? Does it go far enough? And do we need greater regulation or guidance? Be good to hear about that.
So the consultation on the draft NPPF is now closed. Our response is out there, and anyone can read it. But I think what I'd say is that we're broadly supportive of the draft because we can see that it retains heritage protections. But I think it is fair to say that we do have some concerns about other chapters and how they will interact with that heritage chapter. So you'd want to see it very joined up in a sort of a golden thread, much overused phrase, but that is how you would like to see it. So we want heritage to support effective placemaking, which it should do. Everything we've talked about today is how important heritage is to how people feel about their place, the quality of a place, how it works economically and socially, and we're not quite seeing that connection in the other chapters. What is good is there's a real emphasis on local listings. So some of the things we've been talking about the buildings that aren't listed, may not be listable, but are still really important. That's there. So that's really good to see. On the design and placemaking national planning policy practice guidance, which I think is the DPPG, a lot of P's in there. So we've been working really closely with MHCLG on that to try and get context as a golden thread that runs through it. So we do think that's a helpful document, and we do think some really good advice in there for councils on how to think about design and development and design codes and how you respond to the character and quality of your existing place. So I think overall we think it's really heading in the right direction. It's just how heritage then joins up with those other chapters on the NPPF.
Great. Well, if you can believe it, we have actually reached the close of our session. So 90 minutes has a way of just flying by. I want to thank you all for your contributions, and everyone in the audience for playing along with Guess the Find and your insightful questions and commentary. I know there's a lot in the chat. If you enjoyed this session, please share it. It will remain available. It will be streaming. Available to stream on demand as soon as we close this live event. So, feel free to share that link. People can continue to register and watch back. Thank you so much, Richard, Louise, Graham, Ollie, and Katie, for your expertise. And if you enjoyed this event, do join us on the 10th of June for Festival of Place in London. So until then, that's all you'll have from us today. But thank you for joining us. Thanks to Civic for supporting this event and bringing this learning to you. And I'll see you next time.